Okay, folks, welcome now to part 3 of the Sedona Connection workshops. In part 1 and 2, I talked about the background, about how we got here, what is the purpose of these funds, why are these currencies being released, and how did we come into this position of being in this financial slavery, who are the power controllers of the slavery that we have been placed under, and how we get to start working our process to free ourselves. Now in this section, what I want to talk about is the background of the world's gold. Where did all this gold come from? How did it come into an existence? Who really has it? How did they get to have it? And who gave them the power and the control over releasing all these funds for us? I'm also going to talk about the dragon family, about some of their history and how they came into being as well, and then the funding process. Well, when we look at this, it's all about the gold, and the gold. It's all about the gold. Now let me share with you here, and it's where does all this gold, okay, let me rephrase that. Where is all this gold we have heard about, and where did it all come from? But before I do that, let me share with you just a few pictures that have been shared with me. Yes, some of them have come off the internet, and others have been given to me directly from, Dragon family sources. This picture right here you're seeing is in Thailand. Okay, and we'll keep going there. There's quite a bit that is there. Now, let me tell you a little partial story of this gold that will be funding our empowerment. This gold is not just in China. It's located throughout Asia. It's in China, Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And it's also what's behind most of our wars and conflicts. You will always find that most wars and conflicts are all financially instigated or motivated, and behind those comes this issue of the power and the control of the gold. Because these elite cabal know if they can control the world's gold, they really can control the world's money supply beyond what the banking system does. It's back to that comment from the Rothschilds in the 1860s. Let us control a country's currency, i.e. through gold, and we will control the country regardless of what laws they make. Well, let's go back again to the Rothschilds in the 1860s. They knew and they understood that there was these massive, massive amounts of gold that was in China. But they didn't have the means to go and get it and take it through military might and power. In the 1860s, it was pretty difficult to move an army of 30 or 40,000 soldiers from Europe to China. You would have to basically bring them by boats, and at that time they were just starting to move into the steam engine era, if not still having to be dependent upon boats by sail. So you can imagine they would probably need 5 to 10,000 of these ships to send that type of an army there, and it takes months to do that. So that was extremely difficult. But they knew of another option. They basically went to this one island in Asia, where this island was pretty much behind the rest of the developing world. Because see, in the 1860s, we're starting to move into the industrial area. That's taking place in the United States, it's taking place in Europe, and yes, even China was starting to move into the industrial area in that era of time. Well, this island that had two feuding clans that were always fighting against each other, they weren't moving and developing like the rest of what was taking place in China and Korea and places like that. They were basically still living in Middle Age standards. They were still living in standards of around the 11 or 1200s. So the Rothschilds did take an example of their military power. They brought in a couple hundred soldiers, their tanks and their guns, and they met separately with the leaders of these two feuding clans, and with each of them they displayed their might and their power. And they basically said, here we are, we're going to give you an option. Westernize and come with us or die. And they said, we'll westernize. So it's really interesting. So now in 1860, you start seeing this huge shift and change. And what island was this? It was the island of Japan. In 1860, the Rothschilds started financing the modernization of Japan. And in a short 40 years, from 1860 to 1900, Japan totally changed because right around the 1900, Japan started its march to basically take over and militarily conquer all of Asia. It was Japan's goal to basically conquer all of Asia. It was Hitler's goal to conquer all of Europe. And when they started this march, you have to realize they went from living in Middle Age standards in 1860, and then by 1900, they were the strongest military might and the most advanced country in industrial power and modernization in all of Asia. How did they do that in just 40 years? That is not normal economic growth and development. The Rothschilds financed the modernization of Japan, and Japan basically became their puppets. And they financed them, and they basically paid their way to go in and take over all of Asia. There's a great book out there that's called The Gold Warriors, and it's the history and the story of Japan's conquering and taking over all of the gold throughout Asia, starting around the turn of the century and leading all the way up to World War II. It's footnoted in absolutely wonderful manner, great content, great details, but it tells you the story about how Japan moved to do this. It's basically called Yamashita's Gold. Yamashita was the military leader that was out there conquering throughout all of Asia and basically raping all the countries of their gold. Well, in 1936, at that point in time, China begins to realize they're in trouble. They have a lot of gold, and they know that they cannot basically defend themselves against this aggression of Japan. So China turns to the United States and says, we need your help. And you can actually go into the archives and you will see that in 1936, there is an article on the front page of the New York Times that shows a picture of 6 U.S. Navy warships berthed at a port in China and being loaded to the hilt with gold, and they're bringing this gold back to the United States. Because China said, we need your help, we need your protection. We can't protect this gold from being taken from China. So they do that. And when the gold comes to the United States, who gets control of the gold? Not the United States government, a private company, the Federal Reserve. And it's ludicrous. And you say, why would they allow a private company to do that? Because people think, remember, the Federal Reserve is a government agency, and it's not. So the Federal Reserve takes this gold and they issue these bonds as collateral to China. And you've heard about these historical Chinese bonds, and that's what they were. Well, the bonds had a 60-year maturity in them. And so in 1996, the bonds mature. And at that point, China then turns to the Federal Reserve and says, okay, our bonds have matured, we want our gold back. And basically what the Federal Reserve says is, screw you. Prove it to the world, we got it. Well, at that point then, China takes the Federal Reserve to the international courts in The Hague. Now, those are private courts, but yet the results, they do leak out, and the stories leak out. They go through the court proceedings. The Hague rules in favor of China and tells the Fed, give them the gold back. Fed comes back one more time, a second time, and says, screw you, prove it to the world we got it. So they go back to court a second time. And once again, the Hague rules in favor of China. And this time, they set a date that the Fed has to come to a resolve with China that they've either given them their gold back or they've come to an agreement of how they're going to be compensated for the gold that they gave to them. And that date is very, very interesting because the courts in The Hague says, if you don't settle by this date, we are going public to the world that Federal Reserve, in essence, you are the largest thieves ever in the history of the human race. And we will take you out. You're a private company, a private corporation. We will see to it that you have to declare bankruptcy and you will not be recognized by any country in the world. You're done. Your history, you're over if you don't come to a compensation agreement with the country of China by this date. And what was the date? Not 9/11, but 9/12/2001. It was 9/11 was the day before the Federal Reserve was going to be history and over, and the cabal would have lost their vehicle to run and rule and control the world's money supply. The other part of the story is what a lot of people don't know is that gold that was brought from China, where was it stored? In the vaults, in the basements of the World Trade Center towers. So they pulled out the gold, they collapsed the towers to basically disguise what was there and to mask so they wouldn't be able to get what was there, and created this massive diversion on the day before they were going to be done and they were going to be history. And most of us also know that it wasn't 2 towers that came down that day, but there was another that was World Trade Center Building 7 that came down 6.5 hours later. That one was very obvious, a deliberate, designed, controlled demolition. And the reality is the other 2 towers were just as well. Any architectural engineer and basically understands basic physics will tell you they were controlled demolitions as well. Why did they do that? Well, they had to pull the gold out to destroy the evidence. But in the 3rd building, that was the headquarters of the Black Ops New York CIA offices, and it was also where all the employees were that basically held the records of the gold and knew where all this gold was. So the bottom line was they destroyed all the evidence, created a catastrophe, created fear, and said it was a terrorist act for us so they could again come in and have this power and control over the process. It's about the gold. It's about the power of the gold that is there. On a second note on 9/11, the day before 9/11, Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, has a press conference. And he says the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, has basically lost $1.6 trillion and we can't find it and we don't know where it is. How in the world does the Pentagon lose about 3 times its annual budget? Where did it even get that money to lose when it spends its annual budget every year? All of that, again, was a designed distraction through this process. You see, the gold is what's behind most of our wars and conflicts. Another illustration is we as the United States didn't go to war with Vietnam to stop the spread of communism. No, it was because there were trillions of dollars in gold in this massive tunneling system throughout the country of Vietnam that we went in there and tried to find it. And that was the real reason why we had gone into war with Vietnam. The conflicts with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, again, when you really know the true evidence, it's about the power and control of gold. And more recent was the killing and the removal of President Gaddafi of Libya. Again, it was about the power and the control of gold. Gaddafi was in the process of setting up a unified single currency throughout all of Africa that was going to be gold-backed. They were going to go to a single gold-backed unified African currency, and Gaddafi was the leader of that, and he was getting support for it, and there's no way that these powerful control cabal elite would ever allow that to happen, because then they lose control of all the ebb and flow of the money coming in and out of Africa. So where did all this gold come from? And why is it so important in our world history? Well, first let me share with you the history of who brought this gold forward. There's new archaeological evidence that's going to rewrite our world history, because this is stuff that we were never taught in our schools, and they still don't teach it hardly at all in the public schools today. This new evidence is what's coming from the ancient Sumerian tablets, and it's displaying a world history that is so different than what we were taught in school. And these ancient tablets that are being discovered in the archaeological digs, this has been taking place in the last 30, 40, and 50 years. And I want to introduce you to a book that, in my opinion, has the ability to basically change our world history. And it's this book here, Anunnaki, Gods No More, by Dr. Sasha. This book details the history of the ancient Anunnaki race, how we as humans evolved, and where all this gold came from. Now, Dr. Lesson is known as one of the foremost scholars on the history of the Anunnaki. He has a PhD from UCLA, and he's been studying them for close to 40 years. And in his books and on his Facebook page, Dr. Lesson talks about the history of the Anunnaki and their influence on the human race. I've had discussions with him. I've met with him personally in his home, And I've always asked him, when you write these books, is it based on folklore, or is this based on actual historical research that's coming out of the tablets? And he will say, everything that I write has a foundation of the historical research that is coming out of the tablets. Now, there are a few areas that I have to create some hypotheticals or potentials, but I still come back to the basis and the foundation of all of this is based on solid historical archaeological research. As I discussed the Anunnaki race, this ET galactic race, it's important to understand that the term refers to a very broad race that appears in multiple forms. If you were to go and do your own research in history on Google or YouTube, you will find that the vast majority of it paints the Anunnaki in kind of a single type of a phase, and they've almost always put them in there as the black hats, the bad guys, the ones that are here to have power and control over our world. It's really important to understand that they are a multiple group, and there are sub-races that are underneath them. And they have both white hats, very benevolent, caring for us as humans, as well as the black hats that are addicted to this power and control system. Just as we as humans have good people and bad people, well, so does the Anunnaki. So it's important to understand, as I'm discussing them, I'm referring to a very, very broad race of ETs that have multiple sub-races underneath them, and they're not all the same. You can't put them all into a single box. Now, I had an interview with Dr. Lesson in his home, and it was really interesting, the story about this, because it was a couple years ago. I was doing a workshop in Seattle, and I had a gentleman that was from Maui, and he came to the workshop, and he says, "Dave, you need to come and visit us in Maui." And I thought, I could do that. I've never been there. I'd love to do that. So I went there, and we were there, and we got in the midst of talking and discussing about the currencies and about Dr. Lesson. And I basically had told him, I really want to meet this guy. I'd like to meet him face to face and ask him some questions. And I thought that he had lived in Southern California. So there I am in Maui, and I'm talking with them, and I'm saying I want to go meet Dr. Lesson, and they say, "Sasha, oh no, he just lives over there on the other side of the island. He's been there for 37 years. And I thought, oh my gosh. So they made the arrangements for me, and I was able to go in and meet with him about 3 weeks later. And I spent the very first day I met with him, I was in his home for 6 hours. And we began to share things with each other, and we began to realize we were filling in each other's story about the Anunnaki that we didn't know. He was the historian that understood the Anunnaki, but didn't understand completely how the dragon families fit into that. And I had the understanding of the history of the dragon family, and I didn't totally understand how they had fit into the Anunnaki. As we shared with each other, we realized we had completed each other's circle of understanding the bigger picture. Now, I have an interview with him. It's on my YouTube channel, and this explains the picture of the Anunnaki and their history with the dragon families. Now, Dr. Lesson has 3 other books. Now, I will get in a little bit later of talking about how the dragon families with all this gold are related to the Anunnaki, but basically they are Anunnaki descendants is what they are. Now, I will talk more about that later in detail. Right now, I want to show you about Dr. Lesson. He has 3 other books. One of them, Anunnaki False Gods. The second one, Anunnaki Legacy of the Gods. And this is his latest book, is Marduk, King of the Earth. There's his Facebook page that any of you can go on there, and you can go and do add yourself to his Facebook page if you would like. Now, the Anunnaki, who are they? Why did they come to Earth, and what has been their history with the planet Earth? Well, instead of me explaining it to you, one of the best things for me to do is read directly from the excerpts of the opening of Dr. Lesson's latest book, Marduk, Anunnaki, King of the Earth. He can state this far better than what I can. It's important to know that all these statements are based on research from the ancient Sumerian tablets, and they go back to about 8,000 years old. So now, let me move up here a little closer, because I'm going to read off of my my computer here, but let's go through this together as I read this. Long-lived, hundreds of thousands of years, extraterrestrial Homo sapien giants that were 8 to 12 feet tall from the planet Nibiru. They rocketed to Earth and mined gold some 400,000 years ago. 300,000 years ago, they created Earth-adopted, short-lived mine slaves. That's us, from their genome. We called them Anunnaki, people from the sky. They taught us hierarchy, greed, slavery, debt, and they made us worship them and call them gods. 200,000 years ago, Enki, their chief scientist, begat his own line of earthlings whom he exalted. He begat Noah with Badanash, his earthling lover, in 11,000 BC. And after Noah's flood, Anunnaki ruled through Noah's sons and descendants. And after the Anunnaki ruined their eastern Mediterranean cities with nuclear blast and fallout storms, most of them returned to Nibiru. But some stayed, they and their descendants, the power elite, i.e. the cabal, that rule us to this day. The Nibirians showed us how to obsess on one-upsmanship, to kill to rule. We watched them kill each other. Our ancestors had to plunder, enslave, or kill whomever their particular masters, the dominant Nibirian and the Aryans, told them to. The Anunnaki loosed plagues, nuclear bombs, and other weapons of mass destruction upon us. They raised speech barriers and forbade learning. They and their spawn made exclusive hostile nations and religions to keep us divided. They addicted us to credit institutions to keep us slaving. The Anunnaki stand feet taller and live millennia longer than we. They bred us as short-term slaves and soldiers. They killed in their names Allah, who is the Sumerian Nanar, Yahweh, sometimes Enlil, sometimes Adad, and Inanna, who is Ishtar. Mining expedition personnel, all Nibirians. They bred us to slave in mines, armies, businesses, schools, governments, farms, factories, brothels, and building projects. They made us worship them and serve the royal lines of ever-murderous hybrid rulers and the elite that they begat. Most of the Anunnaki returned to Nibiru. A few who remained on Earth and the hybrids through whom they still rule give all factions and nations credit and arms and engineer wars among them. The elite run competing religions which they say will bring back the Anunnaki God of their faith and defeat gods and followers of other faiths. The ancient scenarios of divide and rule to this very day make us deplete our resources, pollute our environment, and wage wars. The matrix the Anunnaki modeled makes us recklessly exploit our resources and pollute. The elite and their ET controllers see that we never feel our unity as a planet of peace. Anunnaki and hybrid overseers imprinted their greed, one-upsmanship, and dominator consciousness on us. They modeled, dictated, avarice, domination, slavery, competition, hate, and violence. Yahweh and Allah-Nanar murdered many. These Anunnaki lacked compassion and showed neither love nor divinity. But here's where I want to stop and explain. They are not all the same. Because now here, Anunnaki, Enki, Nigashidra, and Nimma, they love us and continue to work to free us from the mental virus with which Yahweh and Allah have infected us. Enki, Nimma, and Nigashidra can, when we stop warring, advance our astronomy, medicine, and energy and rocket science and survival strategies. They have the ability to help us in our evolvement when we are ready to step in and let them do that. Now, why do I put such an emphasis upon the Anunnaki? Well, we cannot deny their existence. There's way too much historical evidence that is there. And it takes time for people to go through the process to work through their cognitive dissonance. And when I say the people, predominantly the history teachers and the historians that teach us our history, because they have to work through their own cognitive dissonance, because they have to basically admit what they have been taught and what is being taught to them and what they're currently teaching going back 80 to 100 years, it's all wrong. And they don't like to admit that. But so why do I now put such an emphasis upon the Anunnaki? Well, nowhere in historical research have I been able to find a reasonable and tangible explanation of who we are as a human race, where we came from, and why we have, as a collective, we have such dark behaviors of domination, control, and wars. Let's watch this video from YouTube called Anunnaki, the Gods of Men.
The origins of many things on this planet do not always begin on this world. In truth, most of what humans call knowledge comes from aliens. And this knowledge is not justly distributed. When we think of God, we think of an almighty being or a group of beings that are worshipped across the earth. From Buddhist to Christianity and to Muslimism, Judaism, and Hinduism, every religion has a leader or a god. So there must have been intervention by a group of beings. The theory is that the Anunnaki came down to the earth from the planet of the crossing, Nibiru, and gave humans a quantum jumpstart of sorts. This led to the creation of humanity. It is strange to think this could be true, but there is a growing belief that this is in fact an accurate historical account, and there is plenty of evidence to back it up. Wait till you hear this. 2 governors of Earth sent from Nibiru to rule Earth were responsible for all this power and control. They gave the ancient Sumerians their architectural, agricultural, astronomical, and cultural training in exchange for labor and gifts to the gods in the form of a lot of mining for gold in order to save their home planet Nibiru's failing atmosphere. It makes sense to us that there must have been intervention from beings beyond this world. Indeed, we see them as gods because that is exactly what they are to us. The Sumerians credit all their accomplishments to the gods who were worshipped and depicted in the ancient Sumerian texts. We are on the verge of questioning everything we thought we knew about the human civilization. Yet, the deeper we delve into history, the more we realize our very short understanding of history is completely false. The earliest known usage of the term Anunnaki came from the inscription written during the region of Gudea and the 3rd dynasty of Ur. In the earliest text, the name is applied to the most important and powerful deities in the ancient Sumerian pantheon, the descendants of the sky god An. Sumerian texts describe the arrival of the Anunnaki to the earth from a supposed planet called Nibiru some 450,000 years ago. They were tall beings around 3 meters in height who would have settled in Mesopotamia and, by genetic engineering, accelerated the evolution of Homo sapiens, us, contributing their genetics and, of course, creating mankind. Some authors argue that evidence of the Anunnaki came from the Bible, where they are referred to as the Nephilim, although some other translations call them giants. It is believed that they greatly contributed to Earth with technology still unknown to us, and that they were involved in the construction of pyramids around the world and numerous other ancient megalithic sites. So, who were they? Were they just part of a great ancient legend? If the Anunnaki created us, who created the Anunnaki? Just a thought. It's not a question of whether they exist or not. The evidence overwhelms and confounds many across the world, but will they come back? How would we take an alien presence on the earth today? When you think of it, they are our creators. So the fact we are thriving on this planet today really does make us the aliens. Do you guys have any interesting facts about the mysterious creator gods of humanity? The word Anunnaki, for example, literally translates as those who visit the earth from heaven. Crazy, right? We would love to hear from you, so comment below. Thank you for watching.
Anunnaki have been the rulers of our planet, and their influence is still here. While most of their influence is dark in nature, it's important to understand that they're not all the same. Some have great love and compassion for us humans. Now, on a side note, if you think the Anunnaki have not had an influence on humanity and images of our culture, take a look at this. How many of you really know what this is? This, folks, is in Hollywood. This is the entrance to the Davis Theater where the Oscars are held. It's the entrance to the theater where the Oscars are held on an annual basis and the Oscar Museum. You go through this arch, and if you noticed at the top, on both the left figure and the right figure, are Anunnaki. That is basically Enki. Why is Enki shrined at the entrance of the theater that holds the Oscars in Hollywood? Well, it's understanding the history of the Oscar statue. It's designed after the statue of Ptah, it's an ancient Egyptian practice. See, the ancient Egyptian pharaohs would give this statue of Ptah to honor the best image makers. And isn't that what Hollywood is? Aren't they the masters of being the image makers? The movies and the entertainment industry and the media that they put out, they make and create images. And this was designed after an ancient practice of the Egyptian pharaohs. And they would give this statue of Ptah. And you look at the statue of Ptah, the current Oscar statue, it's not an exact replica, but designed after the same form. And who is Ptah? Enki. Enki is Ptah. Now, Enki is the benevolent one. Now, I don't know why they chose that, but unless it's just the history. But it's like, why would they be doing that? It shows you the power and the influence that is there. Now, the good news is, all that history and influence is changing as we as a collective are waking up. While we see bad influence coming out of Hollywood, we also get to admit that this new photon light energy is changing our DNA and helping us to wake up and shift our past behavioral encodings. And the good news is that the photon light energy is changing the Anunnaki as well. Because this photon light energy is not just on Earth, folks. It's in our whole complete galaxy. So what is the Anunnaki history with the human race and the gold here on Earth? And how does it fit in with the dragon family? Now, I will cover more of this later in the workshop.